Thanks everyone for joining. Trevor is with us. He is our 2022 recipient of the Daphne Zepos Teaching Award. And for some background, the Daphne Zepos Teaching Endowment has two scholarships. The DZTA, which Trevor is the recipient of, is our largest scholarship. His topic is on rennet, and it is such an amazing journey that we've been following on, for him for a long time as milk trekker. Many of you have seen him, but we love to do these moments of continued education with our recipients as much as possible. We are very cognizant that everyone can't always be present for the actual initial presentation. And we very much consider these scholarships as one step along a recipient's journey. And the hope and the goal is always that we get to continue educating with their work at the helm, and they get to continue to evolve their body of work. We're very excited to be able to host this virtually. Thank you for joining us. Trevor, I'm gonna let you kick things off.
Thank you, Tess, and thank you all for coming. What I'm going to talk with you about today, as you know, is some ideas around rennet and how it is made. And I'm going to tell this story by going all the way back to the biology of ruminant digestion. And then we're going to follow how rennet is made and used from there into the cheese vat, into the final cheese. And my focus is going to be on animal rennet and on the abomasum, which is this organ, the fourth compartment of the ruminant digestive tract. You can see me holding here, and that you'll see a lot of images of in the next half hour or so. So I'm going to explain its biology, the enzymes that are in it, and how this for me is the root of cheese making. And I need to thank the Daphne Zepos Teaching Endowment for the opportunity to give this talk and to have done this research. And also thank L. Pomper, who took these photographs that you can see here. And it's really amazing to have his content to help tell this story. And you can follow me on Instagram and Substack, where I post as Milk Trekker. And also my new endeavor is the Sour Milk School. So you can check out the website there for natural cheese workshops that I do. So the objectives will be to describe these types of rennet and the relevant enzymes that are used, and explain how and where they're made and what impact they can have on final cheese flavor and texture. And another thing that's really important for me is to share the stories of the makers that I visited, these original knowledge holders who freely shared their information and techniques with me, and talk about how they view their choice of rennet as being important to their cheese. And in order to do this, what I'll first do is define some terms and some vocabulary, and then we will discuss the anatomy of ruminant digestion and the coagulating enzymes. And then we're going to go and visit some places, starting with the island of La Palma in the Canary Islands, where the farm level production of whole stomach goat rennet is still really strong. We'll move to the Basque Country and look at Idiazabal and the use of whole stomach lamb rennet, before going to Castilla y León and visiting a rennet production facility, and then going on to Catalonia to start looking at thistle. And I'll talk briefly about thistle rennet in both Catalonia and another one of the Canary Islands, Gran Canaria. So this is showing us where the Canary Islands are in relation to Spain, off the coast of Africa. And so this is about as far from the mainland of Europe as you can get and still technically be in Europe. And then the Basque Country in relation to Catalonia and Castilla y León. So these are kind of some of the terms I'm going to be using a lot. Proteases are enzymes that break down protein. And in the case of rennet, this is the mechanism through which milk is coagulated. So rennet is acting on protein to cause coagulation. And proteases are also involved in the breakdown of protein that's known as proteolysis, involved in the texture and flavor development of cheeses. And the primary protease that we're going to talk about that's involved in coagulation with animal rennet is chymosin. And this enzyme appears to be specific to milk and is found mainly in ruminants. A secondary enzyme is pepsin. This is a more general enzyme found in many mammals, and it's generally considered inferior as a coagulant, meaning that it has a weak clotting ability and is strongly proteolytic. So you get some interesting flavors out of it that maybe are not as desirable for most of us. And then I'm also going to be continually talking about an abomasum. And this, again, is the fourth compartment of the ruminant digestive tract. And this is where chymosin and pepsin are secreted and milk is coagulated. It's the most similar to our stomach. So it's highly acidic, and milk goes there directly when the animal drinks it. A final term is lipase or lipases. These are fat digesting enzymes. That's kind of like a broad term for enzymes that break down fat. But in cheese, we're talking about enzymes that are going to lead to these very particular piquant or picante flavors and sensations. I generally refer to it as spicy, although it's more of like a nasal spiciness or like a mouth numbing feeling. And the process that lipases cause, the breakdown of fat, is known as lipolysis. So one thing that I'm kind of trying to do and hoping to do, and I think am doing, is shifting the thinking on rennet types from this binary distinction between animal and vegetarian to like more broad terms. I don't really like the term vegetarian rennet for reasons I'll get into, and reasons you may already know from my ranting and raving about the subject. But I think it's an important distinction to make. So by animal rennet, I simply mean rennet that's actually derived from the abomasums of milk drinking ruminants. By plant rennet, I mean plants sometimes contain enzymes that happen to coagulate milk. I say by chance because these enzymes didn't evolve to do this. It's like a happy accident. And so those will be different enzymes than the ones that are found in animal rennet. And so some examples of this are ficin, found in figs, or cardacein in cardoon thistle. And oftentimes plants will have multiple enzymes in there that are involved in coagulation of milk that humans have throughout time figured out have these properties, most likely by cooking plants in milk or somehow combining these things and observing that coagulation occurs. The third category is synthetic rennets. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into this, but I encourage you to look into it more or ask me questions at the end. The most common synthetic rennet is called FPC, fermentation produced chymosin, which is used in the majority of North American cheeses. It's like 90%. And this is sometimes referred to as recombinant calf rennet, which I think is a better term for it because this is a product of genetic modification. It's actually the first GMO to be approved for use by humans in the US. And it's a pretty fascinating story about how this stuff came to dominate cheesemaking, not only in the US, but now around the world. I can go out to the most remote parts of northern Albania looking for traditional cheesemaking. And so oftentimes cheesemakers will, when I ask them what rennet they use, they hold up a little bottle that says Chimax on the side, which is the C.H.R. Hansen product. FPC is sometimes confused with what are referred to as microbial rennets. Microbial rennets, it's kind of like you don't see them as much anymore. FPC has really kind of come to dominate, but microbials are derived from various fungus that produce coagulating enzymes. For me, this organ right here really gets to the roots of cheese making and the roots of the ethical dilemmas of consuming milk and dairy products. So this is the abomasum. You can see it here beautifully surrounded by caul fat, and then showing the inside contents. What you see is cheese. It's coagulated milk, and for me, this is the original cheese. It's surrounded by kind of some partially digested plant matter. It's very spicy. Like, I've tasted this quite a few times, and it's an incredible experience to try this original cheese. And I say this is the origin of cheese making, and I think of the human technology of cheese making as being a form of biomimicry, meaning that we're kind of recreating this situation that happens biologically in animals. Humans didn't invent cheese making. It's been a part of mammalian digestion for a very long time. And where the abomasum sits in the body, I think, is really important to show and describe. So this is a piece of the original cheese in my hand. And these are some hanging abomasums that will be dried with the stomach contents inside. So that cheese will become a part of the rennet. And that's one particular style of rennet, the one that kind of fascinates me the most, whole stomach abomasum cheeses. So this is kind of a diagram, and I like this one because it shows that the 4 compartments aren't like linear, but they're kind of all wrapped around each other. And if you are ever able to participate in the slaughter and butchering of an animal, I encourage you to look through the organs and try to identify this system. It doesn't have to be a young animal. If you're just doing it for demonstration purposes, you can see all of this in a fully grown animal. And it's really easy to identify the abomasum. It has a super distinctive shape to it. And it's at the end of this tract where it meets the intestine. So what happens when a young animal is drinking its mother's milk is that the milk is swallowed down the esophagus, and it actually bypasses the rumen, which is the large purple section back there. It bypasses it and kind of goes just around a corner in the omasum and into the abomasum. And this is a design. It's kind of like a bypass, because the milk doesn't need to go through ruminant digestion. The rumen isn't online yet in a very young animal. And so the milk just needs to go directly into the abomasum. And you can actually identify there's like a groove that goes from the esophagus into the abomasum. And you can see how close those two things are in the end with the anatomy of the animal. This image is from Sardinia. I was just in Sardinia again, but this was taken last December when they were slaughtering their lambs, which they still do there at a very young age. And what this shows is the size differences between a young animal and a fully grown animal. So in this image, you can see at 20 days old, the abomasum is the largest section of the stomach or of the digestive tract, where the first 3 sections on the bottom are still very small and undeveloped. So it is like, it's the largest organ because it's the one that's doing the work at this point in the animal's life. It's the most important part. And the other sections will only start to develop closer to 30 days or sooner if the animal is eating a lot of plant matter. So for this reason, people who are making rennet try to prevent the animals from eating plant matter, to keep the abomasum full of just milk and to prevent the shift to start happening as the organs change size. So you can see even at 30 days, the abomasum is much smaller and it's darker in color because the animal is starting to consume a lot of plant matter and slowly moving towards being weaned. And we can even think of weaning partially as being a process that's driven by this shift inside the animal's body. So the milk that the animal's drinking is bypassing those first three sections and going directly into the abomasum where the chymosin and pepsin are secreted. This graph is showing the shift in chymosin and pepsin. So what happens is when an animal is first born in its first week of life, the abomasum is producing almost entirely chymosin, this enzyme that's designed to coagulate milk. And then as the animal gets older, more pepsin starts to be produced. And that's what this graph is showing, is that the amount of pepsin is increasing. And you can also see the size is changing, the relative ratio of the sizes of these organs. So once an animal starts switching to this plant diet, it's less ideal for using for rennet. Once the animal is over like 30 to 40 days is about the maximum generally, as there's a reduced percentage of chymosin in the organ itself. But you do see quite a bit of rennet, especially that coming from Europe, that will have 80% chymosin, 20% pepsin. That seems to be like kind of what most people consider to be a shutoff point. I'm now going to get into a discussion of the first type of rennet, of animal rennet, which I refer to as whole stomach rennet, meaning you're going to use not just the skin of the abomasum, but what's inside of it, this coagulated milk, the cheese. And so what people are looking for when they do this are pure white abomasums full of coagulated milk. And these will be tied and hung to dry or brined. And by using the skin and the cheese inside, you are introducing these piquant umami lipase flavors into the cheese. Sometimes with a fresh cheese, it's hardly detectable, but I think there's something even in a fresh cheese happening in the background, like an elevated umami. But mainly these lipase flavors evolve as a cheese ages. And this style of rennet is now rare. I imagine it used to be much more common in the past, but it does remain in a lot of pecorinos, especially those made in Sardinia and Sicily. It remains in regions of Spain and also in like Turkey, some of the Balkan countries, and Georgia. I've seen it quite a bit in Georgia, actually. And so the first place that we're going to go will be La Palma. Let me actually go back and explain this lipase flavor thing. So this style of rennet, whole stomach rennet, is the style with the most enzymatic and bacterial diversity, meaning like this is going to put the most stuff into a cheese, and that this has slowly been limited until you end up with what cheesemakers use nowadays, 100% chymosin, which is the opposite of diverse. The flavors that are like almost always introduced by this type of rennet, these lipase flavors, are on the tongue. There's this spicy, sharp, mouth-numbing sensation. I think most people are familiar with this in a cheese like Parmigiano Reggiano, which has that in a really low dose. But they can also lead to this deeper presence of umami, like an extra dimension that ties all the other flavors together. And this method is endangered. And I think by looking at it, it can show us the potential for making local rennet and this idea of a full circle cheese making, where the sacrifice of the animals that is implied by dairying has not been outsourced. So I think it's really important to look at this, even if it's not something that most cheese makers are going to do. It's important for the science and the history of it and the cultural connections to dairying. So on the island of La Palma, I consider this to be one of the last strongholds of traditional farm level rennet making in Europe, probably the strongest stronghold. And like the other strongholds, there is a cheese intimately linked to a breed of animal. And this is the Cabra Palmera, the goat of the island. Almost all the cheesemakers on the island use these animals, and they have fought to keep these animals, and they really identify with them. And they're beautiful goats with these long curving horns. And like a lot of these older goat breeds, they're super skittish, even though they're domesticated and they've been milked daily for a long time. They're like still semi-wild, which I like. And so the cheesemakers here are making this cheese called queso palmero, and it's made in a lot of different sizes and sold at different ages, and it's almost always hot smoked from a variety of materials. And almost all the cheesemakers there are either producing their own rennet from their own herds, or they're buying these pastes that are made by a slaughterhouse on the island from the goats of the island. And that degree of rennet sovereignty, I haven't seen anywhere else. This is showing the cheese at 3 different ages. And the first cheesemaker, so it's eaten like at these fresh stages, where it's just lightly salty, smoky, along to a long aged version that has some of these picante flavors, but not as much as other cheeses, and some like beautiful tropical fruit flavors. It's a really good cheese. It's hard to find it outside of Spain. The first cheesemaker that Al and I visited is Nazareth Perez Gonzalez, and her farm is Granja Los Barbusanos. And you can see her here smoking her cheeses. So all the cheesemakers have these ahumadors in their facility where they smoke different plant matter, and it takes like 10 or 15 minutes, and then they wash the cheese and it's ready to be aged. The smoking is helping them to age cheese in a hot climate. And what I've heard a lot of people say is smoking has been done in many places to prevent infestation by flies, so that you're not making kasi marzu accidentally. So this is the rennet. And what happens here that's really unique is that there is a slaughterhouse on the island operating at EU standards. And the cheesemakers have organized themselves pretty effectively, I think, and obtain an exemption for the traditional usage of their rennet. And so they will send their goat kids to the slaughterhouse at 10 to 20 days old. And that's the youngest I've heard of anyone doing this, 10 days. So maybe that's kind of like a low extreme. And they get the abomasums back from the slaughterhouse with these little yellow tags on them that have a traceable number. So then it becomes like any other ingredient in your food. And they're responsible for the curing of the stomachs, which they do by covering them in salt. They like bury them in salt, and the salt pulls out a lot of moisture, and they're left sitting in that moisture. And that's how they store them until they make rennet, which they would do by pulverizing the skin, the cheese, and this really salty broth that actually has a lot of the enzymes in it as well. This is what the landscape looks like there. You can maybe understand why they're not trying to dry the abomasums, but storing them in salt. It's a fairly humid place. So I imagine that's why this happens. This is another cheesemaker we visited, Brenda Rodriguez Concepcion at Los Tumbitos. And you can see her like jar full of these abomasums. And notice that these ones don't have the yellow traceable tags on them. She's still doing this herself on her own farms, outside of that EU sanctioned system. And it seems like EU food safety laws are kind of just beginning to be enforced on the island. So she's still doing it herself. And the rennet is mixed up with water, and about a week's worth is made at one time in this plastic bottle. And then it's used to make this cheese with no added starter culture, just rennet. And like if you make rennet this way by putting the abomasums in salt directly, it's my feeling that you're going to lose a lot of the lipase flavors, which degrade in salt. So there, if that's what you're going for is lipase flavor and enzymatic diversity, this might not be the most suitable method. The cheeses themselves don't have as much of that lipase kick. And I kind of learned the most about rennet making in the Basque Country, where they also have a breed of animal that is intimately linked with their culture. These are the Lacha sheep, which are symbols of Basque heritage. And it's really fascinating to me that these places that have these strong rennet traditions have this huge pride in their animal breed. It means that they are still intimately linked to the idea that they are killing their animals and eating them, and that there's value in every part of that process. So Idiazabal is the cheese that's made in the Basque Country. It like really is the dominant cheese, for better or worse. And the PDO for this cheese requires the use of the milk of the Lacha or Caranzana breed. This cheese is made as both a smoked or a natural version, and traditionally was made from lamb rennet pastes. And like the island of La Palma, the Basque makers have an exemption to allow them to continue making rennet on their farms with their own animals. And they've kind of fought to keep this tradition going, which is what Basque people seem to do. And this man is the guy that kind of taught me the most that I've learned about rennet. This is Aneko Goiburo. He runs this agriturismo called Andare up in the mountains. It's like a short train ride from San Sebastian. It's a beautiful place. Anyone can go stay there, and this guy is amazing. So he is like a real big proponent of upholding the shepherding tradition of the Basque people. And he shared freely with me his whole process. So what happens here is that the lambs are taken to the slaughterhouse, the abomasums are given back to the cheesemaker, and then they hang them to dry, full of this milk. And you can see it inside there in like various stages of dryness. And these ones aren't even tied off at the bottom, because there's actually like a muscle, like a sphincter muscle, that closes and stays closed. Some people tie them off, but it appears you don't have to. And then the top is actually open, probably to allow air exchange. And they're hung from what would be like the entrance side of the abomasum. And everything moves through the abomasum, obviously, in a linear fashion. So they're hung like this is in a garage to dry and then be used for making rennet. I've like cut open and looked at the inside of a lot of these abomasums, and you can see different things happening inside. This one on the right here, this is a short video, and that's like the best I've ever seen. It's just cheese, and it's like cheese in different little chunks, where it's actually been squeezed by the stomach muscles. The coagulated milk is what I would refer to as it's cut, like the curd is cut into various sections by the stomach muscles and peristalsis. That is what you were looking for. You want these like really plump white abomasums that will have clean balls of cheese, and you don't want to see a lot of wool or plant matter like you see in this image here. Most of that's going to have to be discarded, all that wool, and it's kind of dark looking. This is not going to make good rennet. And what Aneko explained to me is that this, if you added this, it will cause off or gamey flavors in your cheese. So it's really a battle, and it's probably, it requires a lot of effort to prevent something like this from happening, because very young animals, if you've spent time with calves, kids, or lambs, you know that they're always experimenting with eating things. from being just a week old, they're like picking up plant matter and wool and swallowing it. And that gets incorporated into the coagulated milk. So what people who are trying to make super clean rennet do is they have these very young animals, 10 to 25 days old, in an area where they don't have access to hay or pasture. So they're not going out with their moms. This is an example. You can see how clean this space is, and it actually has slotted floors, which was allowing any plant matter or wool to fall through, so that these animals were just drinking their mother's milk. And then this is what a neko does when he goes to make rennet. He cuts open each individual abomasum and then picks out with his knife little bits of wool. It usually comes together as like a solid ball, but he would kind of painstakingly clean it out. He would cut up the skin and the cheese on the inside and add salt to it. And this would become his paste. So he would do this once a month, and the abomasums were dried and then frozen without any salt in them. And he feels that that was the best way to preserve the enzymes, especially that lipase flavor, which is a flavor that's being lost in idiathobal cheese. And he was lamenting the loss of this flavor. As idiathobal becomes this like globally traded cheese that has to appeal to the masses, it's becoming sweeter and it's losing this character that he considered a really important part of the cheese. And this was a story I heard repeated in so many places, that the cheese didn't taste the same anymore when people switched from this rennet to using the synthetic or just liquid animal rennet. So what his process is happening with abomasums that he took out of the freezer, cut up, and then is adding the salt to make a paste. The paste will be mixed with water and then used to make his cheese. But he would just make 1 month's worth, so that he said even by the end of that month, he was losing some of the lipase flavor. And then when he makes cheese, he actually blends the rennet paste made from his stomachs with a liquid rennet in order to get different levels of those flavors. And that's an approach that I really recommend looking at and experimenting with, is the blending of rennets. So these rennet pastes can also be bought. And this is the way that this type of stuff is going to be the most approachable for cheesemakers. You're not going to probably be drying and preparing your own abomasums, but you can buy a rennet paste, like Walco Ren sells them. You can buy kid and goat pastes in order to add a little bit of these flavors to cheeses. So they can be, these rennet pastes can be made from dry, fresh, or frozen whole abomasums full of coagulated milk. And as I said, they can be used to add lipase flavor in conjunction with liquid rennet. And it's almost always lamb or kid paste. I've never actually seen calf paste. There seems to be something special with the rennet from lamb and kids that has that particular flavor that's desirable. And this is used in a lot of cow milk cheeses in Italy. So a lot of caciocavallos have this added as a flavor element. What we see here is the rennet on the island of La Palma that the cheesemakers there can buy from the slaughterhouse, and it has this really strong smell. And then on the right, we see the rennet that's made from this company called Cuajos Caporal. The third style that I want to look at is liquid rennet made from just the skin, meaning that there's nothing on the inside. It's either cleaned out, or if you want to harvest an animal with the coagulated milk on the inside, it needs to drink milk like ideally within a few hours before it's slaughtered. So with the liquid rennet, they're probably just working with stomachs that are already fairly empty. The animal hasn't drinking milk that day. This is the most common type of animal rennet. When people say they use animal rennet, this is what they mean. And in order to make this rennet, empty abomasums are dried and then steeped in water to extract the enzymes. And this liquid rennet will contain mainly chymosin and pepsin, but it does have small amounts of lipase that can create mild, piquant flavors in long-aged cheeses. There's multiple sources of lipase, not just rennet. There are lipases in raw milk. There are lipases that are kind of like results of the bacterial starter cultures as they die and release their enzymes. Some of those enzymes are lipases. And there is small amounts of it in liquid animal rennet as well. So this was the only like rennet production facility that I got to visit. It's a really small facility, and it's kind of like a craft level rennet making. And I think Spain is incredibly lucky to have this. So this is in Castilla y León, and the production of this rennet is tied to a dish called lechazo de cordero. It's suckling lamb dish, and this is a delicacy in the region with like a PDO. And because people like still have this delicacy, the slaughterhouses are slaughtering these very young animals, and this company is able to obtain the abomasums from multiple slaughterhouses. So they get them like a whole day's worth, which is what you see in this container here. And they sort through them, and they discard any dark ones that are maybe from older animals that have been eating plants, and they keep the ones they want. If they have any whole ones that still like have a lot of milk on the inside, they freeze these and then grind them for paste. And the best looking ones they hang and dry, but that's a really small amount of their production. Most of the rennet will be dried. Most of the stomachs will be dried empty in this room. And then once they're dry, stored in sacks until a batch of cheese can be made, or a batch of rennet can be made. And so this room was a total trip to go into. It like smelled like prosciutto, and this was the highlight of my cheese journey, to see all of these, a whole room full of them. It was high temperature, low humidity to facilitate the drying, and to make sure that this is done according to EU food safety laws. So we can see what they look like as they dry. On the left, you have 4 days old and 10 days old, and you can see how much they shrink. And then in the bottom here, you see a freshly salted empty abomasum hanging to dry. And so they salted them just like, they didn't even measure the salt, which surprised me. They were just like sprinkling salt on there and then hanging them. And the salt was being used to pull moisture out. I'm imagining most of the salt is leaving along with that moisture and dripping off. So once they have the dried abomasums, when they're going to make a batch of rennet, they like pulverize the dried abomasums, put them in these sacks, these like porous sacks, and hang them in these tanks that they circulate water through for a couple of days. They're steeping in this water. And you can see this guy like opening the valve, and he's got rennet on tap. It was the coolest thing. And it's dark in color, and they then take it and standardize its strength and adjust the pH, which is important. They have to take the pH down, and there's something about a lower pH than the use of something acidic that does some magic to activate the enzymes. And I've seen this done on like an artisan level by cheesemakers who are using sour whey to extract the enzymes. And that's what I recommend if you're making your own rennet, is sour whey as the liquid to pull the enzymes out. They're doing it with just water and then altering the pH later. But I think there are advantages to using something acidic to start with, and why not use whey? Cheesemakers are so lucky to have access to this product, and they credit it with giving unique flavors to their cheeses. And a lot of the cheesemakers are proud to be using this regional rennet. And this is pretty ideal for me. I think that this is a model that could be replicated in other places. It's very special, and I'm so glad that I got to see that, and they were happy to have me there. So the last type of rennet that I'm going to look at will be plant rennets. And I'm just going to talk about thistle, although there's multiple plants that are used. Thistle is the most common one. And a lot of the other plant rennets are really only used, as far as I know, for fresh cheeses, because you can start to get some strange things happening when you try to age cheeses that are made from plant coagulants. It can go in really rapid proteolysis to cheeses that liquefy and develop bitter flavors quickly. So it's a different coagulation that happens when you use plants. It's a fragile curd, as there's no chymosin and pepsin involved. It's different enzymes. So these are cardoon thistles, and it's these purple stamens that are used to coagulate milk. And it's in Catalonia that I was first exposed to this. Not a region that most people are thinking of thistle rennet, but it traditionally was used there a lot. So this is a region outside of the normally associated regions of Portugal and Extremadura, where the use of herba col, which is the word in Catalan for cardoon thistle, has a long history that has largely been lost. And the cheesemaking scene in Catalonia is marked by a lack of traditional cheeses and an openness to a range of French influenced styles. And I got to meet a cheesemaker who is working to revive the use of rennet. And this guy is Pep Venturos, and his company is Formates Queiroz. So this guy's like a natural cheesemaker who is really doing amazing work. He raises his own goats and grows this cardoon thistle, but he only grows enough to use for his lactic cheeses, which obviously require a much smaller dose of rennet. So it's like the ingredients for his cheese come from his farm. He grinds his own charcoal for ashing his cheese. And his process for making the rennet is to dry the flowers and then soak them overnight. So like he has a big box of dried flowers that he can use for his whole cheese season. And he pulls the stamens out, the purple stamens, and then soaks them in water overnight. He pounds this in like a mortar and pestle to extract the juices, and then strains it and adds this to the milk. This is a good style to experiment with lactic cheeses, because such a small dose of rennet is used, and the rennet has a less dramatic impact on the ripening of the cheese. So the last place I want to look at is Gran Canaria. So we're going back to the Canary Islands, where sheep cheeses are made from thistle. There's actually 3 different cheeses made with 2 different coagulants, and they give them different names, which I thought was really interesting. So Flor de Guia is a DOP cheese that has at least 60% of this Canarian sheep milk blended with cow and goat, and it uses just thistle rennet, either rennet made from flowers picked on the island from 2 species of thistle, or increasingly bought as a liquid. In Spain, they have quite good access to thistle rennets. Another advantage to being a cheesemaker there. And the use of this rennet leads to this rapid proteolysis, or at least the usage at the dose that they're using leads to a rapid proteolysis of the paste into this gooey thing that, like if you've had a torta from Extremadura, or like a really ripe, soft wash rind cheese, this proteolysis is breaking down the paste into these mildly bitter artichoke flavors by 25 days old. And they had really like defined timelines for these cheeses. They recommended that people consume them at 25 to 40 days. older than this and it will get too bitter and dried out. So like at a window, which they considered it to be the right time for eating it. But it had an incredible amount of flavor for 25 days. So there is also this accelerated ripening that happens from thistle. Then they have a separate cheese called Medea Flor, half flour, which follows the same recipe, but uses half thistle and half animal rennet. And they give it a different name because it's a different cheese. It's like the choice of rennet is that significant. It's a harder cheese that's aged 2 to 8 months. You don't get that rapid proteolysis and development of the bitter flavors, but you do have that subtle in the background vegetable bitter artichoke flavor combined with some of the other flavors you normally associate with an aged sheet milk cheese. And this was the one that interested me the most, that combination. And then they also make a cheese called queso de guia that uses just animal rennet and can be aged 8+ months. It was so cool to be able to see side by side those 3 cheeses and know that the cheesemakers have an awareness of what the type of rennet does to the cheese. It's a beautiful island, and the Canaries are like a hot spot for cheese making, and each island kind of has these different traditions. Just a fascinating place to visit. And the cheesemaker that taught us about this is Paca Medina Moreno from her company Altos de Moya. And she is picking the thistle herself and then doing a very similar process to what we saw in Catalonia, soaking the thistles overnight, adding it to milk, getting a pretty quick coagulation. I think you have to use like a high dose of thistle in order to get that rapid proteolysis and softening. And you can see her cheeses over here, how much they resemble a wash rind cheese. Even though that's not really what's happening there, I think these are just kind of like indications of a specific type of ripening. And somehow the use of thistle induces a similar process with rapid proteolysis. And then the cheeses are left to age on these like canes. It's actually in arundo grass. And they go through their like moist, lovely, soft phase, and then they become increasingly dried out. So these were some of her, I think, older cheeses that she hadn't sold. What I found in my research is that a wider range of rennet is available in Europe compared to North America, and that this contributes to the quality and uniqueness of cheeses made there. I think more of this range could be available in North America, both in terms of importing the products that are used in Europe, which seems to be incredibly hard to do, or domestic rennet making is possible. The only real barriers to it that I see are legal ones, but potentially financial or economic ones as well. But like mainly that's what's in the way. And the big conclusion, or the big thing I want cheesemakers to take out of this is that I think it can be really interesting and a whole other aspect of techniques that can be explored in the blending of rennet, in the blending of like liquid animal rennet and animal pastes to give just like to throttle the amount of lipase flavor you're adding to a cheese. Just to have like a slight dose in the background, kind of like if you're adding like a little bit of fish sauce to a soup or a tomato sauce. You wouldn't taste fishiness, but there's this elevated umami. So that's something that can be really fun to play with. Or the blending of animal and plant rennets. Like I know a cheesemaker who adds a very small dose of thistle rennet to their sheep cheese. And again, this is doing like some small background nuance, flavor, and impact on ripening. So I also think that it's hard to make firm statements about how the use of a specific rennet will affect a cheese, because the rennet is interacting with the other ingredients involved in cheese ripening, and it's kind of like a huge web of variables. But the general things that can be taken away, I think, can be best experienced by trying some of these cheeses, and having more of a conversation about rennet and what it does to cheese.
Thank you to everyone who attended tonight. The DZTE truly largely gets funding through events such as this tonight. So we are really grateful for any awareness you can continue to bring to Trevor's work, to the work of all of the recipients under our umbrella, past and present. Go forth, spread the word. I hope that this gave you a lot to ruminate on. Thank you so much, Trevor.
Thank you.